Hello everyone, my name is Jared and I just finished making the spooky, creepy, crooked fence and fence columns for my haunted yard display this year. Now, there's quite a bit going on here, from a light-up jack-o'-lantern to some light-up vines along this fence. So let me show you how I did it. To build the fence structure, the first thing I did was took 36-foot long cedar Gothic picket fence planks, and I cut them down to 36 inches each. To build the frame for the fence, I took a 1x3 pine board and cut it down into 2-foot long sections, one for each end of the fence. From there I took two 8-foot long 1x3 sections, re-drilled them, took some wood glue, glued them, and then screwed them to the 2-foot long sections on the ends. With the frames now complete, I set about marking a line on each one of the picket fences, 4 inches from the bottom of the fence plank and 8 inches from the top of the fence plank. That way I knew approximately where to attach it to the fence frame. Then I attached one plank directly in the center of the frame and one on either end of the frame, 3.5 inches in. Then took the remaining 12 planks and distributed them along the length of the fence, sort of evenly, and I just slanted each one to make a cool looking crooked fence. Keeping in mind that I didn't want any of the fence planks to be any lower than 4 inches on the bottom of the frame. And then I just began screwing the fence planks down to the frame, using the lines that I had previously marked to keep the screws in the same spot on each plank, just in case in the future I wanted to take these fence planks off and stand them straight up and down rather than crooked to make a different style of fence. For one set of the fence columns, I'm going to use a 2-foot by 8-foot 3/4 inch sheet of partially sanded plywood. I've already partially made one set of columns, and for that I just used 5.5 inch pre-cut pine boards. I took that 2x8 sheet of plywood, took it to my table saw and cut it down into 4 5 3/4 inch strips that were 8 foot long, and from there I then cut the strips into 36 inch pieces with a 2-foot piece left over that we're going to use to go around the top and the bottom of these fence pillars. With the boards now cut, I'm just going to go ahead and run a bead of glue along the edge of it, stick that top on, and then I will just pre-drill it and use black drywall screws to fasten them together. There's many different ways that you could fasten these columns together, but I'm just going to go ahead and use screws. I'm just going to do that up and down the entire length of the column. Using the plywood got me a nice square column with no cupping compared to when I used the 5.5 inch boards. As you can see here, there was a lot of cupping and it made putting that trim along the top kind of difficult, and I had to sort of improvise with the top of the column. Next, I'm going to add some trim along the top and the bottom of each column using the leftover plywood that I had. So here I'm just marking the face of it. I've already cut 145-degree angle into that board, and I'm lining it up to the edge and making a little line. Sticking it in my chop saw, cutting a 45-degree angle, and using the piece that was cut off as the next piece that's going to go on. And I'm just going to repeat this process until I've got enough wood for both columns, top and bottom. And I'm going to once again use wood glue to attach the trim to the column, and I'm going to drive some nails into it using my brad nailer. And I'm going to repeat the process for the top of the column. The only exception is I used a 1x3 piece of pine board instead of the plywood. Well, this thing is really starting to shape up. It's looking pretty good. My next step is I took some 1x2 boards and I cut them down to 27 3/4 inches is what it came out to. And I'm going to place them on the column like so, just for a little bit more of added dimension or interesting look. And I'll just glue and air nail these just like I did this and this. Now I'll add one final layer of 1x3 trim to the base of the column. With all that wood on it, oh man, that is really heavy, and I still got a little bit more to do. One thing, if you see here, I cut this one a little bit short, so there's a bit of a gap, but it's not a big deal. I can just put a little bit of sandable caulk in there and then paint over it, and it'll be fine. Now that I got the sides, and the top, and the bottoms on these columns, it's time to put this top on it. So what I've done is I took some leftover 3/4 inch plywood, I cut it to shape, or cut it to size for these columns. I'm going to fasten it to it, and then I'm going to do one more layer of trim around the edge using a 1x2. And for the final piece of this puzzle, I took yet another piece of plywood, cut it down to fit within this square here, and then I just took my chop saw and cut 45-degree angles into it all the way around, just to make it look a little bit more decorative. And now I'm going to fasten a pumpkin on top of it. I temporarily assembled the fence, and now I'm going to give it a spray coat of light green paint. I chose light green because ultimately I want the entire thing to be a creepy green color. It just fits the theme of my display. First, I'm going to give it a little bit of a gray, some gray streaking using some gray stains. I like to use a lot of different shades of paint when I paint something, but in the end it's ultimately going to be a green color. Now time to do some vine work. I've taken a section of jute netting, cut it down, and laid it along the fence to get an idea of how long I'm going to need it. And from there I just start working the individual strands of the jute netting out into about the approximate size I want the vines ultimately to be. I'm going to use about half of these vines on this fence section and the other half on a separate fence section. Now this technique, I just take a brush and start brushing on some green latex paint, twisting the vines and shaping them as I go. Now as long as you use enough paint, it'll actually stick and dry to the fence, and it should hold pretty good. You might have to go back over it a little bit later with a little extra paint if you want them to be really rubbery or really latexy. Now another way to do these vines, and this is actually a little bit better than the way I just did the other ones, is to just take your jute netting and get it loose like so, and then dunk it directly into the paint and then apply it to the surface. Now both of these techniques are pretty messy, so if you don't want to get paint on whatever it is you're doing, keep a wet washcloth and some paper towel. Just wipe it down as you go. I'm not worried about it because ultimately it's going to end up being a green fence. If you don't want to make a mess, there is a third way you can do it, and I'll show you that a little bit later, and it's probably the best way. Looks pretty good. I'm trying to paint the fence pickets a little bit greener shade than what they were originally, so I still got to work on that, and I got to finish these two columns, but not bad for now. Just continuing to do a little bit of paint work on these fence columns, using the leftover green latex paint, the same paint I made the vines out of, brushing it on pretty thick, and then just taking a wet washcloth, wiping it off, blending it, streaking it, just making it look antiqued or aged. And again, the green color might be a little bit unusual, but it fits my overall yard display theme. I'm reaching the final steps of finishing the fence columns. And what I want to do is put some toppers on them. Now I've got 2 different sets of fence columns on either end of those fences. And on one end, what I want to do is make some lamps. And what I got here is some of these old, these old style plastic trick-or-treat buckets. I've had a bunch of them laying around. I wasn't sure how I wanted to use them. So what I decided to do was take those and cut out the eyes and the mouth and cotton and latex over them. And I'm going to use these for the lamps, essentially. So this one I've done a black wash over. This one I'm about to, but so you see what a difference it makes just doing a black wash over those. For the other set, I've got a couple of these. I don't know, they're like resin pumpkins that I picked up this year, I think from Joann Fabric, something like that. The idea is to stick them on top of the columns. If you've ever seen those fence columns that have like the round spear for the column, that's the idea, except it's going to be a pumpkin. For the actual light portion of this, what I've done is I've purchased a couple light sockets, some flickering bulbs, and a couple pieces of lamp cord. And on the end of the lamp cord, I've just crimped down a couple stake-ons, and I even soldered it just a little bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to stick these onto the lamp socket, and then I'll silicone over top of it because these are going to be outside, just to give it a little bit extra protection. Now, with this pumpkin, I would imagine this lamp or this bulb is still going to completely emanate through the lamp. It's still not going to just come out of the top through the eyes and the mouth. I did spray paint the inside of it black, but I imagine it'll still glow, which is really what you want because that's what an outdoor lamp bulb does. It glows from all areas. It's just I want you to be able to see also that it's a pumpkin shape. Well, the flicker bulb works. That's a positive. Oh, yeah, okay. Actually, it looks a little bit more like a jack-o'-lantern than I thought. I honestly thought the bulb would glow through the pumpkin even more. Now to attach the other pumpkin to the other fence column, what I've done is I drilled a couple holes into the bottom of it, ran a couple bolts through, and I put a nut on each one, and then I went over here to this little piece that screws to the top of the fence column, and I drilled 2 holes with the same spacing as what I did for the pumpkin and countersunk the top a little bit. What I'm going to do is set this right through there and put a nut and a washer on the bottom of it, and then just go ahead and screw that back to the fence post. I'm also going to put a little bit of liquid nails on there. Clearly you don't have to because you've bolted it to the top, but I've got it, so why not? Well, now we've got this pumpkin attached to this fence column, and as you can see I also did a little vine work on that column, and I'll go over that in a minute. Now over here for the lamp, what I've done is I've drilled a hole just large enough to stick the lamp cord through, and then one on the side so I can run it along the fence to plug in. And all I have to do now is take the bucket where I've dremeled out a hole in the bottom of it large enough to fit the lamp over it, and then just drive a couple screws into it. Now we have both pumpkins attached to both fence columns. Talk about this real quick. I mentioned these vines. I made up some additional vines like I did for the fence here, except I just dunked them in the paint, twisted them, and left them out to dry, and then I just attached them separate. I used these blue Romex staples. I can take a little bit of the green paint left over and I'll just blob it on there to hide them a little bit better. I mean, you could use whatever. You could use a screw and a washer or glue, or I'm sure you can figure out something, but that's what I chose to do. The other thing I did was I bought some green LED Christmas lights, and I tie wrapped them all along these vines because at night you wouldn't see the vines, but with those green lights behind them it'll pop up in a vine shape, and I think it's going to look pretty cool in conjunction with the pumpkin lamp or lantern over there. So I decided to add one final little detail, and I thought this was pretty cool. It's just a old pumpkin that I had carved up and sort of painted to look like, kind of like an old vintage pumpkin. And what I've done is I have impaled it on one of these Gothic pickets and just created some pumpkin guts coming out of it, spilling down the fence, and I added some fake realistic blood to it. That'll dry, that'll look really good, and even though it doesn't really make any sense why the pumpkin would be bleeding, I thought it was a cool little, just fun thing to do. I also added some back here to this fence. Now the blood is, like I said, I'm gonna have to wait for those guts to dry a little better, and then I'll add some more blood. Right now it's kind of turning pink. I should have waited. The way I made those pumpkin guts is the exact same way I made them in the pumpkin burster, corpse bursting out of a pumpkin video that I did. So if you're interested in that, I'll post a link to that video in the description below. I do some pretty cool stuff in that. Oh, I like the way that looks a lot. I got it all lit up here, or at least one of them. In a second here, I'll turn this outside light off so we can see it in the dark. Go ahead and turn that light off. Oh yeah, that's gonna look really cool. Now of course I made two of them, so when I get it finally set up in the yard, it'll be even brighter. A little bit of a PS here. I ultimately didn't like originally what I had done with the vines around the columns, so I kind of came out and fixed that and wrapped them. I thought they looked a little chaotic before, and I originally was gonna leave this pumpkin that wood color, but I think I'm gonna go ahead and paint it roughly the same color as the rest of the fence. So right now I've just got a spray primer on it, but once it dries I'll go ahead and blend it in with the rest of it. Now these two lengths of fence, along with everything that I've been making so far, all are part of a larger display. It all connects together, so let me get started on the next one.